Welcome to Baseball Biz on Deck. I'm Mark Corbett, your host. And with me today, I have Mr. Rick Vaughn. I met Rick shortly after I did a few shifts at the Tampa Baseball Museum. And if you haven't been there, you need to go there. It's in Ybor. Anyway, I saw Rick's book sitting there on the shelf. I hadn't met him yet. And there it is. And I'm learning all about St. Pete and spring training. I mean, it's a separate book, the one that we're going to talk about today. And then later on, I got to meet the man. Hey, how you doing, Rick?
Doing great, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you back again. I mean, I enjoyed talking with you, about the whole book about St. Pete and Al Lang, how they brought the teams into St. Pete, and then the tourism that came along with it. Rick, as I opened up Tampa Springs Training Tales, I find 2 or 3 things on each page, something new that I'd never heard before. And you find the words as you walk us through Tampa and spring training in those other early days. And you give us the color of what's going on at that time. It's not just an iteration, in fact.
No, thank you for mentioning and noticing that. Thank you.
You give a sense of the climate, but you see at that time the control some people had. Okay, for instance, the mayor of Tampa was also the publisher.
Right, publisher of the Tribune. Yes, McKay was his name. Yeah.
And so I guess why McKay is trying to negotiate with the Cubs, he's really offering everything. And I mean, who was the guy that he was talking with at the time, the Cubs? I can't remember his name, a chubby fella.
He was not a super respected guy.
No.
He really wasn't all that respected. And eventually the other owners kind of forced him out of the league.
So the Cub owners, like I say, he's going back and he's telling everybody in Chicago, hey, man, this field is perfect. It looks great. I can't wait to get everything down there in Tampa. But as a point of caution, he sends his own guy down there who evaluates everything and says, it's a swamp.
Yeah. Yeah, it needed a lot of work. He clearly was overselling, what was going on there. And they had a really difficult time at first. Getting that place the way they wanted it, but eventually, it worked out. It was the beginning of, really spring training. I looked it up. This year will be the 100th time, the 100th spring that Tampa will host spring training. And really, having the Cubs there at the beginning, I think really, really, really did help because we went one year, I think, without a team, and then the Red Sox and Babe Ruth came in 1919, and then it really pretty much went from there. Other than into the 80s, when the Reds left. So you really had a team from almost every year, pretty much from 1919 till the mid 80s, other than the war years where no one was able to come south for spring training. So the Cubs it was important. It was very important, and up to that point, they'd had a good club. And they had, Tinkers to Evers to Chance. The spring that they came to Tampa was the first year those 3 guys weren't together. So It's kind of an odd thing, I guess, for them going to camp without, those 3, just really, really pedestals for them over the years before, 7 or 8 years before.
Yeah, there's a lot of events that came to Plant Field. And what you're talking about, the different players who were there at different times, going through the spring training. My first introduction to Plant Field was coming to the Tampa Baseball Museum and seeing that huge mural over there hanging on the wall. Well, actually,
I love that picture.
It captures a moment in history. But the thing of it is the first person there at the museum I met said the only thing they could share with me was that big mural. They said, look, see this guy here, number 42? That's Jackie Robinson. That's him on a spring training day here in Tampa. And that was pretty much my depth of knowledge of Plant Field. That and the highway marker I saw near where Plant Field had been, the one about Babe Ruth and his longest home run. But gosh, man, Rick, you wake us up to real full history in this book of what all it was like. I mean, that kind of, you take us through what happens with the Cubs.
Yeah, there was a year there where there was no club. And the Cubs really at that point, they only left because the team got sold. And one of their investors at the time, he wasn't the main owner, but he was one of their investors, was a guy named Wrigley. And Wrigley ended up, of course, taking over eventually. but he had a real interest in wanting the team to go to the West because that's where his interests were, and that's why they ended up leaving. From all indications that I was able to research, the Cubs, they really liked playing there, and you'll find out the thing that everybody really enjoyed playing there, and really its strength, for me, was, Tampa didn't have the Yankees and the Cardinals training there like St. Pete did, but the location was huge. It was in a perfect spot, not only for the teams, but all the scouts who came south to scout spring training. They all used Tampa as their headquarters. All the national writers that came through to cover spring training and go to all the camps, they all used Tampa because of its central location as its headquarters. And so what ended up, and then the hotels there were very accommodating, very good hotels, very good restaurants. And so you had a lot of what really kind of kept that timeline moving, I think, from the teams that came in, was the fact that it was centrally located. It was great venues there. And so a lot of important league meetings were held there. The thing that I really loved reading about was the Yankees did their 50th anniversary of their team, which was 1952, and they unveiled their all-time team, and they didn't do it in New York. They did it at the Columbia Restaurant in Tampa. That was their big media event for that. So I thought that was awesome. But after the Red Sox came in and Babe Ruth, and that was obviously a pretty historical thing, even though they were just there for a short time, and Babe hit the long home run there, which is marked by a state historical marker and all. But then the Senators came in and they had Walter Johnson, and that was a big deal. They won the World Series in 1924. So in 1925, what was kind of a cool event, and it was a really huge event for Tampa, was the commissioner came in during spring training. And back at that point, the World Series winners got medals. They didn't get rings, but they did the medal awarding at Plant Field for the world champions. Wow. And it was a huge media event, So that was the other thing, because with Ruth here, with the Cubs here, with good Cubs teams here, there was a lot of national attention that got brought on to Tampa. So the Senators, they left. The Tigers were here for 1 year, but it was kind of a cool year because that was the first time that Hank Greenberg wore a Tigers uniform, a major league uniform, was at Plant Field. It was his first season, and he did not disappoint. He had a great spring training, and he immediately caught the eye of many, many people. And then, of course, the Reds came in, and they were here. They were in Tampa forever. They came and didn't leave, and they had an extraordinary relationship with the city. The Reds didn't win a whole lot during that time until the Big Red Machine came along. But Tampa and the front office of the Reds really had a great understanding, a great relationship, a lot of trust and honesty to do the right thing by the city. And that's why that lasted for a long time, because there were other teams that wanted to come into Tampa because of the reasons that I mentioned. And so you had the Reds there forever. Great history, again, especially towards Pete Rose coming in and Johnny Bench and the gang that formed the Big Red Machine. And the first time that group ever got together was right there in Tampa. The first time all the parts were assembled was in March of I think it was like 69 or 68 or 67. But that was the first time they were all together. And then when they ended up eventually leaving, and if you know the history there, Tampa was trying to get a major league team, an expansion team, and they really put spring training on the back burner, and they went full throttle after a big league club. And the Reds did not like what was going on, didn't like what the future meant, and couldn't get finally, after all those years, the relationship went sour, and so they left. And then lo and behold, they tore down Al Lopez Field to make room for a major league stadium. And then they didn't get a team, unfortunately. So we were without a club in Tampa for 8 years, and then George Steinbrenner and the Yankees came in and have been there ever since, starting in '88. And they've been a great, neighbor, great citizen to have. I mean, they have a 10,000 seat ballpark and they sell it out most of the time. They really do. And they've been a great neighbor. And then again, they call it the core four, the Yankees core four that sort of started that whole dynasty in the late 90s. First time they ever got together was right in Tampa. And so there's a lot of cool history there. And I appreciate that you noticed the detail that I tried to bring and the things, that I tried to bring to really every sentence. And that comes back from my beginnings with the Orioles. Bob Brown was the PR director there. I was the assistant. And he always, said to me, don't put anything. We used to have to do game notes every night. He said, don't put anything on that sheet that people aren't going to use. If TV or radio or newspaper is not going to use it, don't put it in there. And so I sort of took that approach when I was writing the book. You know what I mean? I'm like, don't just throw something in there. Don't throw your opinion in there. People don't care about your opinion. You're not a great writer, but you are a pretty good researcher and you have a good, way to put it into perspective. So I tried to make every sentence in that book. Maybe somebody learned something from almost every sentence in that book. That's kind of my philosophy of writing.
Well, we have a mutual friend, Josh Weaver. I told him this. I said, Josh, man, when you got to read this book because there's facts in there, but I said, Rick tells it in a way that he has with so much color, and you keep it condensed. You're not expounding on and on and on with something, but you're able to give a story color and a sense of support, a sense of importance that came with it. I want to make a point because it was actually going to be a question, man. The opportunity to find a major league team for this area, was that kind of the death of Al Lopez Field? And from what you said, it kind of sounds like it was.
Yeah, I think it was. You go back, I wasn't living here then. I didn't experience it firsthand, but just from what I've read and the people I've talked to over the years that I've lived here for 27 years, the competition between the two cities really didn't help. They really were, there was the St. Pete side and the Tampa side, and there really wasn't a whole lot of cooperation. And I think that hurt us, not getting a team when the Marlins got the team in the South instead of us. And yes, and I think the fact that everybody was so focused, we sort of, I read a couple columns and a couple stories. Tom McEwen had a column that basically said that Major League Baseball kind of gave Tampa a wink and said, hang in there, you're getting a team.
Yeah.
And they took that as gospel. And I think that's, that was their motivating factor for the TSA, the Tampa the Sports Authority. And I think they moved forward thinking that was going to happen. And unfortunately, Al Lopez had gotten, pretty old by that time. It was built in 1955. So it was over 40 years old. But it was sad that that's how it went down. And I think a lot of the guys that I talked to who played there, they felt that way too. Yes, it was a cranky old ballpark and all. Yeah. But you know what? A lot of guys who played Legion ball that went on to play big league baseball played in that ballpark because a lot of American Legion games were played there. Not everybody, but a lot of guys played there. And, not everybody, but a lot of guys played there. And, my talking to Wade Boggs about how much that ballpark meant to him for a bunch of different reasons. But one of them was that he played there when he played Legion ball. And so I think it hurt a lot of people, especially, of course, Al Lopez, was probably devastated that this monument was getting torn down. And I think from what I read, I think he thought something else was going to come up eventually in its place. And of course, it never did. So.
Yeah. So you see something like that. You said, there's my legacy. And now it's a parking lot. I was glad, when I saw where Tony Saladino and others who did a lot to make sure that we had another way of honoring Al Lopez, and that was with the Al Lopez Park. Some parks I see, and they're not bigger than a postage stamp. You drive in, there's a name that they're honoring somebody with, a few acres, maybe 3 trees. But that's not the case with Al Lopez Field. It's a beautiful place. They also have a nice statue commemorating Al there as well. But going back to what you were saying about as far as people who play there, people like Wade Boggs. And while he was there, he got some of the news about being brought up to the majors while he was there, wasn't he?
Well, it was funny. He first thing he told me was when the draft, the day of the draft, the Tampa Tribune asked a couple of the guys who were local that were supposed to be pretty early picks. They asked them to come down to the offices that day so they would be there and they could interview them and take their picture for the story the next day. And Wade was there for all afternoon and didn't get taken. And by like 4:00, he's like, I got to go. I have a Legion game tonight. So he goes to the ballpark and they're taking infield or batting practice. And the woman who is still his wife after almost 50 years, Debbie Boggs, Debbie was his girlfriend at the time. She comes running down through the bleachers while Wade's out on the field, like taking infield, and she's screaming, Wade, you got drafted in the 7th round by the Red Sox. So, his father was there, and the three of them kind of stood by the fence and kind of assessed it for, just really on the surface, just for a couple of minutes. And, Wade said, my dad said to me, you know what, Wade, that's a great place for you to go. The way you hit the ball that way, you were going to hit 300 there. Of course, he certainly did. And then the other part was after he signed with the Red Sox, was in their minor league system for 6 years and hit 300 pretty much everywhere he went in spring training. The year that he made the club, he didn't know he was going to make the club, but they were playing the Reds. And it was one of the next to the last games at the Reds home games. And the Red Sox were the visiting team. But when he was there, he sees Johnny Bench on the field and Johnny Bench says to him, hey, congratulations on making the club. And Wade was like, what are you talking about? He goes, I haven't made the club yet. And he goes, I think you have. And as it turned out, the scout that signed Wade was at the game, and he knew what the Red Sox were going to do. And he had kind of blurted it out to many people in the stands, and it got all around. And he said, my dad knew, Debbie knew, I didn't know. Everybody else in the park didn't know. So that's where he found out that he was going to make the big league. So he had some really good, cool stories about Al Lopez Field.
When you look at all the players who came through Plant Field one time and another, let's see, I can't remember. But that number was immense. Can't remember how many it was. I can't remember.
Oh yeah, well over 100. It wasn't in the same. It wasn't close to what Al Lang was. Al Lang Field and Waterfront Park and Al Lang Stadium was actually over 200, but you had two teams training there.
Yeah.
And, Plant Field never had more than one team. And Al Lopez had the White Sox and the Reds for like 5 years at the same time. And that was it. The White Sox were there, and then they left to go to Sarasota. So you didn't have that opportunity. But yeah, there was still so many great players that played there. And then you had the All-Star game there, the famous All-Star game, the spring training All-Star game in 1940, which, there were 11 teams training in Florida at that time. And there were 6 National League clubs and 5 American League. And they put the All-Star game on to benefit the Finnish Relief Fund. They were involved in a war called the Winter War with Russia. And the United States was trying to raise money to help Finland. And the All-Star game that they put on from 11 teams was really good. It was really good. The American League had DiMaggio and Williams and Jimmy Fox and Greenberg and Dickey and Bob Feller pitched, and the National League was stacked too. But it was a great All-Star game. So think just how many Hall of Famers played in that game alone. That was pretty amazing.
Well, thank you for that, because when I saw that, I loved it, because I read that chapter about the same time as I was reading the Tampa Bay Times that morning, and Romano was saying, the Rays have never had an All-Star game. There hasn't been one here in Tampa. I'm thinking, well, sort of.
I know. I was going to drop him an email, but then I thought better of it. But what was cool about that game, too, is that it was so successful.
Yeah.
The reason that it probably got the game, Miami was trying to get the game, St. Pete was trying to get the game. Al Lang, the father of St. Pete baseball, Mr. Sunshine, was heartbroken that they didn't get the game, partly because he was such an influential person in Major League Baseball at the time. Yeah. But one of the reasons they got it was because they could put 13,000 people in there, which was more than they could put at the other 2 ballparks. So, but the really cool thing is it was so successful. Even to the point where the only Tampa native in the game scores the winning run, in the 9th inning, in the bottom of the 9th inning on a walk-off. But the game was so successful. They raised the equivalent of about $500,000 today. That's what they raised for the Finland Relief Fund. But it was so successful. A lot of the national writers, pretty much all of them, were big fans of making that the All-Star game every year, playing it in spring training and playing it in Tampa. And it got a lot of momentum. That was primarily from the pundits and all, but it got a lot of momentum. And when they went to the winter meetings that year in Chicago, it came up for a vote amongst the teams, and it lost. And the reason it lost, I think, is the same kind of thing that's going on today. With the World Cup is the risk of injury. The game, especially back then. I mean, they played that game as if it was a World Series game. They didn't want to lose to the other league, and they played really hard. And I think, I'm not sure I put this in the book, but I think DiMaggio's first game that spring in 1940 was the All-Star game. He had been late to camp. And so you could see where the owners had a point, to risk injury and, that early in the year probably wasn't worth it. So it got defeated by the teams, but it got all the way to a vote. It was that serious. Wow. And everybody had such a great time. The weather was great. So many things went well that day. And I thought it was a great day for Tampa. There's no question about it. I think I did put this in the book. The Tribune had 19 stories around that All-Star game in their paper the next day and 21 photos. So the whole newspaper was just devoted to the game, which was pretty cool. But there was so many national media there, and they were all writing great things about Tampa and the effort that they put into it. And they really did a terrific job as hosts, and they raised a good amount of money.
I mean, you could see with a different set of eyes than most of us, Rick, because you've been in the front office for several years. I know with both the Orioles and with the Rays and probably other teams. I'm not thinking of it at the moment. I apologize for that. I get that. Okay. The thing of it is, though, you can see with a vision that the rest of us don't have. We don't. We don't have that perspective. But when I was reading your book, there were certain things that clicked in my head. Now, obviously, there's a lot of clicking going on in my head, but in this particular instance, it was about the fields. They weren't being maintained at one point. And I had to wonder between that and segregation, is that one of the reasons that the Cactus League evolved? That we didn't pay enough attention to the teams that were here and the fields that were kind of, allowed to lapse. They weren't being kept in great shape. Between that and segregation, I mean, both of those things kind of impacted maybe the advent or the growth of the Cactus League.
Well, I think it was a couple of things. I think that might be true. I think the fields were probably okay, but I think some of the teams, I mean, having a major league club for spring training was kind of a big deal. It got you a lot of publicity. It certainly helped St. Petersburg drive the whole tourism bus for them. But I think maybe some of the teams felt like they were getting taken for granted, which, you want to have a team here, you kind of got to do the little extra things that are maybe a little more than you want to do. But that's what you have to do if you want to keep teams. And I think they felt a little bit neglected. I think the teams that were out there, they were probably out west. There were like 4 teams or whatever it was at that time, or maybe a couple more. And I think they were out there primarily because of their ownership had some interest out west, and it was in their best interest to have a team out there. As I mentioned, the Cubs moving out there they were out west for a long time. I think that was more of it. I think it was more that the teams felt a little bit neglected. And then once the 60s rolled around, and you still had Jim Crow laws in the South. You still had up until 61 or 62, you still had teams whose black players couldn't stay in the same hotel as the white players. And that didn't exist out west. And so I think that was kind of a lever. I talked to Bill White, who, God bless him, he's such a great baseball ambassador in his own way. He was first baseman with the Cardinals at Al Lang. He went on to become the president of the National League, and he was the first African-American play-by-play broadcaster in baseball for the Yankees. But he I talked to him, and he was like, he had been with the Giants out west, and when he came, east and south, he was taken aback by what was going on. And I think there was a question or an issue where some of these teams could put pressure. The West could put a little pressure on the Southern teams because they didn't have to deal with any of that. That wasn't going on. That wasn't an issue out there. And the black players appreciated that. And I think that helped put a little bit of pressure on the Florida teams. And I think that's why they eventually started to finally change. It was very slow movement. This was before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it started to finally change in the early 60s. And St. Pete was kind of in the middle of that because the Cardinals are there and their players started to become outspoken about it. And then it kind of, it caught on to other teams. Bill Veeck was with the White Sox. They were in Sarasota. Bill Veeck, he got it. He made sure they had a hotel that accommodated their team. And then the Yankees ended up leaving St. Pete after 61, and they went to Fort Lauderdale. Now they went because they didn't have to share a facility anymore, like with the Cardinals. They were the only show in town. They had a larger training facility, a bigger stadium. But one of the other reasons was they wanted a hotel where all their players could stay, and they found that in Fort Lauderdale. So I think a lot of people back in those days. I was born in 55, so I was too young, but I think a lot of people may have gathered that with Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier that everything was fine when it wasn't. Right. It certainly wasn't. I'm sure it wasn't around the league, but it definitely wasn't in the South, like I said, where they still had these very restrictive laws with regards to race.
Yeah, I remember one story. It was I think it was at Plant Field. And Jackie Robinson's walking over by the Plant Hotel. He's asking about the minarets up there at the top. And as he's going over, someone asked him, "Boy, what are you doing here?" or something to that effect. It's like, wow, it's hard to imagine today, I would think. And, earlier you mentioned the Cardinals team, and they took I won't say an extreme measure to rectify those type of things with their teams. They wanted to keep their teams together. And how did they do it? They bought a freaking motel. They bought the Outrigger Motel over in St. Pete so they could have all their players at one place. And, that's very commendable about the team. It's a damn shame about the league and everything else around it that it wasn't doing what it needed to and make that disappear. But I'm not surprised if that is part of the reason why the Cactus League grew more. And if some of the teams may have felt like they were being neglected, that was the other part. So between those things, did that do it? I mean, I'm going through this book. I swear, keep trying to think where it started. Where do I stop to talk with you? There's so much cool stuff in here. And folks, when you get this book, there's another thing I'd mention. There's some really great photos in there from history of Plant Field and baseball in Tampa. One of the photos I really like is a depiction of what Plant Field looked like. It was a drawing, and it shows the immensity of the field and what all it was able to do. Can you give us a brief description of that, Rick?
Yeah, it really started out, at the hotel there at the time, the Tampa Bay Hotel, which opened up right even before the start of the 20th century. And it was a unbelievable hotel. It for a number of years, it was the place to go. In Florida was the Tampa Bay Hotel, and they built a racetrack there. I mean, the grounds were immense. I mean, that was part of the allure of the hotel was the grounds. And they built a racetrack, but then they also, as the turn of the century came along, they started looking at other sports there, including putting baseball there. And so they built like a baseball field pretty much in the middle of the track. It sounds really bizarre. And if you see pictures of it, it does look pretty bizarre, really. But it was, it was the ballpark. It was, for major league clubs. The other thing that allured, and I mentioned to it briefly early on, was the hotels in Tampa at the time when the Cubs came in. Well, the hotel that everybody stayed at for the first 20 years was that Tampa Bay Hotel, which is, you walked to the field. And believe me, that was an expense that the teams had to incur if you didn't have a hotel right near the ballpark. You had to get your players to the ballpark. So there was a transportation cost that went away if you stayed in Tampa. And that was one thing that actually really helped bring the Reds in 1931 was, with the Depression going on. They were the owner of the Reds was looking, who ended up losing the team at the time, but they were looking for any way they could, to save money. And they were in Orlando at the time, but they loved the fact that they could do everything on the grounds. They ate at the hotel, they stayed there, they played there. So that was like kind of the beginning of having an all-in-one kind of facility. And it stayed that way for a good number of years until the hotel eventually, for a bunch of different reasons, ended up going out of business. But it was taken over by the city. But the ballpark remained, and it is kind of amazing in a way that it stayed that long. I mean, it wasn't until 1955 that Al Lopez Field was built, and the teams moved from Plant over to Al Lopez Field. But anyway, that Plant Field was pretty extraordinary, and it's definitely worth trying to find a picture of it. There were a number of different things that happened to it over the years, with other parts of the infield using that as like little practice fields. You could see these other little fields that were out there. It was really kind of a strange looking place. And the picture that we were talking about over at the museum is a good picture. It shows you see the racetrack there. You can see how the grandstands were made for racing. And they had a lot of thoroughbred racing there. They had auto racing there early on, so it had and early on the fair, the state fair was there for many, many years at Plant Field. And that actually became an issue several years where the fair ended right before spring training started, and they'd had, thousands of people traipsing around on the ground that they were going to be taking infield on and playing games on. So the city had to really get the thing turned around fast. And that was one of the things that hampered the Cubs when they first came in that first year, is that place was pretty beat up from the fair. That, I guess nobody bothered to tell the Cubs that was going to happen. But what an interesting ballpark, and that was where Babe Ruth hit the longest, potentially the longest home run of his career at that park. And I read a lot of stories about it. Some were consistent, some were not consistent, but it's clear that the ball was really, was an amazing home run. And the great thing too that came as a result of that was that the Red Sox at that time realized that, this guy can hit, really hit. And they started realizing that they would be a better team with him playing every day than pitching every 4 days. And that I think that home run was one of the things that changed that whole dynamic for him. That year, that was 1919. That year, he began playing legitimately in the outfield quite a bit. He played the most he'd ever played in the outfield. And I don't know if it was, it made it, there were a couple guys writers that wrote that the home run had a whole lot to do with that he became, more and more of a full-time guy in 1919 than he had before. And the home run really woke everybody up about it. So there was a lot of history there. The other thing that was really, I loved found out by accident, was, Ted Williams played there. And he had this famous spitting incident at Fenway Park in 1956 where he spit at the fans and he got fined $5,000. And it was this big deal, And so I was reading this column that Tom McEwen wrote in the 70s. Ted came in, he was managing the Senators, and they came in and played a game at Al Lopez. And McEwen was interviewing him. And just out of the blue, Ted said, this was the first place I ever spit at the fans. And I'm like, what? I read that and I'm like, that's crazy. And it had been 1951. This was like 20 years afterwards. And he was a little off on the details. He told McEwen what happened. So I went back, found the game. The Boston Globe wrote a lot about it. and the local papers hardly touched it, but the Boston papers wrote a lot about it. And it was amazing, that this was the first place he got really upset with the fans they booed him because he didn't. He his first time up, he hit a ball back to the pitcher and he didn't run it out very hard, and the fans got on him about it. And then the next time up, he hit a home run, and as he got to home plate, he spit at the fans. So, and that happened right at Plant Field, So that was pretty, that was interesting. I love those kind of stories. It's a lot of people say, it's spring training, who cares? But and maybe the statistics don't care, but the stories are just as good. There's still really good stories, I think. And I was happy to find some of these things that I know. Tim Kirchin's a very good friend of mine from ESPN. We worked together for many years. And if I would find something, I would email him like a little note and say, did you know about this? And if he said he didn't know about it, I was like, oh, this is gold, man. If he doesn't know about it, I know no one knows about it. So here's a great sounding board for me.
I want to ask you later. You can tell me better now, but I think you have another Ted Williams story that you can tell us a little later, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
When you shared at the signing at the museum.
Yeah. That was you talking about the one with Frank Howard?
Yeah.
Frank Howard. Yeah. That what was funny was that both guys, Frank Howard and Ted Williams, because I got to spend some time with Ted Williams, which is another story, but both of them told me that story. So I know it happened. And it was funny, it was when Ted was managing the Senators, for his first year managing the Senators was in the late 60s. And the day before opening day, they were working out at RFK, getting ready to open the season. And so Ted Williams had not been in that ballpark, and I think he'd been at Griffith Stadium, but I don't think he'd ever been at DC Stadium. Well, anyway, so they were taking batting practice, and Frank Howard gets done, and he comes around behind the cage to talk to Ted while the next guy gets in there. And I grew up in that stadium, so I knew every inch of it. And in the upper deck, the seats. And the upper deck was a long ways away there. You had to really hit a ball to get in the upper deck there. And they were all the outfield seats out there in the upper deck were green. And so Hondo comes around and he says to Ted, he goes, hey, Ted, you see the seats up there that are painted white? And there were about 7 times he had hit home runs into the upper deck. Mm-hmm. And the ball club painted the seat white to mark it, and it was kind of a cool thing. You look up there, you could see those seats, and you were like, holy cow. So he says to Ted, he goes, you see those white seats up there? He says, those are balls. Every time when I hit a home run up there, they painted them white. And Ted Williams did not miss a beat. And he goes, well, did they paint him green every time you struck out?
Ooh, Dad. I love that.
It was a funny story, and they both told it to me, so I knew that I knew it was real.
Oh, that's great, Rick. I tell you. Oh my gosh. We're talking with Rick Vaughn, and we're talking about his book here, Tampa Spring Training Tales. And I looked down at a list here of all the teams that played at Plant Field. I mean, in this book you mentioned, let's see, it was the Cubs, the Red Sox, and even some of the minor leagues that were there, like the Smokers. And I wanted to ask for another story from you. I believe it was the time, let's see, in the St. Pete book, about a time that the Smokers were going to have to play, I think it was the St. Pete Saints. And they were going to play over at Plant Field. But lo and behold, they find that there's actually something that had already been scheduled that day, a bullfight. A bullfight. They had a bullfight scheduled at the Plant Field, and therefore the Smokers couldn't play a home game that day. That's what I remember anyway. So
that kind of thing, actually, not a bullfight so much, but that kind of thing seemed to happen a lot back in those days. There was no central clearing kind of thing. They're just things sometimes got a little bit away from people, but the history there, I loved. The St. Pete book was really about how the city depended upon baseball, whether they knew it or not, for their tourism. It was one of the things that drove. It wasn't the only thing, of course, but it was the main thing. And the thing that I loved about Tampa, it was, they weren't a tourist town. So they didn't have a lot of tourists coming into Tampa to go to the games to fill up the ballparks, so they did not draw really well. Yeah, and those ballparks, we were talking about these two ballparks. They didn't draw well in comparison to St. Pete, who also, again, happened to have the Yankees and the Cardinals, and they all brought a lot of people down. The Reds did not have a huge traveling group that came down, and they dominated the time most of the years here. So, if you looked at their attendance numbers, you would say, well, they really weren't. They didn't draw. No, that city was really, but the people loved it. The people loved the game, and it was so ingrained in who they were, going back to the cigar factory. I loved reading, and I didn't write a whole lot about it, but I loved reading about how important baseball was I wrote a little bit about it, but how much of a unifier it was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, how much of a unifier it was to a community that was made up of many different cultures, Italians, Spanish, Cuban, heritage folks that were here as a part of the cigar industry, making the cigars, and how it was so important to them, how it really, how those cigar factories were they were so dependent on the game, I think. And the people that ran those cigar factories were smart enough to know that, to realize it. And so it may not showed up maybe it didn't show up in the attendance numbers or anything and all, but the love that the people had for the game back then was huge, and one of the reasons that the Cubs came, the city went after the Cubs, and they went after them hard. I mean, they got a lot of criticism because they paid the Cubs to come. That was like, if the Sporting News had this big story about how this was terrible, this was the beginning of the end, that they were paying teams to come in and how awful this was. But they did it for a good reason. The city had just gone through a really bad labor strike in 1911, and McKay, who was the publisher of the paper and the mayor, he saw it as a way to help heal the city, and maybe they could make a little bit of money off of it. But he looked at it as a healing thing, And so I think that, to me, I loved reading about that the baseball was pretty important back then, to keeping community unity through, with the heartbreaks that they had. And it was a very bad labor strike that left a lot of people out of work, and it really fractured the city. But they thought of baseball as the one, as the thing that could heal it. So to me, the love of the game, and you talk to people like Tino Martinez and Lou Piniella and people like that, and how it just runs through the veins of their family. They all played it, and it was nothing. It was a part of their lives. It was not, Right. It was not a big deal. It was what they were all about. I love reading about that.
You mentioned even early on that Vicente Martinez Ybor, the godfather, the man who created Ybor, the city carries his name, he was a proponent of bringing baseball and making things happen. I mean, starting even with that. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. It's not 100% sure where it actually started. It probably was brought over with some of the Cuban folks that came to work, but there was also some baseball being played prior to that, and it was rumored that maybe going back into the 1870s, late 1860s, where returning Civil War veterans brought it back from the north to the south, that maybe that had something to do with it as well. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly where it started, but yes, Mr. Ybor certainly had a heck of a lot to do with it. And I really had fun going through the archives of some of the newspapers in Ybor and, reading about some of that. It was very interesting. The owner of the Cubs was Charles Murphy, by the way.
Okay.
Murphy. Yeah.
I just remembered Chubby. I couldn't remember his name.
He was kind of a buffoon, I think.
Oh.
And,
so I don't know, but Rick, I can think of, is there just one story in here that you think that's one of your favorites in the book? Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of liked I sort of liked writing. I kind of maybe, I might have taken a few liberties in terms of trying to draw parallels here, but I really enjoyed writing about 1963, and that was Pete Rose's rookie year, and how his, he it was one they had. It was really kind of his introduction to big leagues, and he talked. I found a quote from him later that said, this particular incident that I'll give you was really kind of jump started his career into the big leagues, and that was a spring training game in Tampa. The Reds were playing a game, and he wasn't involved in the game that day. He was doing a workout on the other field. He wasn't on the game day roster, and he was getting ready to go to the clubhouse. He was done. The game was going on, but he was done with his work. And one of the coaches saw him and said, "You know what? You should probably stick around." And so he did. He went in, got a drink of water, went back out, sat in the dugout, and in like the 11th inning, they end up going extra innings. And back then, they would play 15, 16 innings if they had to finish these games. So it wasn't nowadays, if you don't have enough pitching, they just end the game in a tie. But so it's like the 10th inning, he ends up going into pinch run. They don't score. He gets up the first time, he gets a hit, but he doesn't score. Now it's like the 12th inning, and he got up, and here he wasn't even going to be in the game. He was just a pinch runner in the 9th inning, and he got a double. And then the next guy hit a fly ball to center field, routine fly ball. He tagged up and went to third, kind of caught the center fielder sleeping, and he ends up scoring the winning run in the game. And he talked about how that was kind of like maybe the first spark of his nickname. Charlie Hustle came from that game. And it really got solidified when they were playing the Yankees later on that spring. And I think it was Whitey Ford and Mickey Mantle kind of gave him that nickname. But he really, and I wrote something in the Sporting News, was like, that's kind of that game that he played in that he didn't even think he was going to be playing in was kind of like the beginning of his career. That's what got people to all of a sudden realize this guy plays pretty hard and he plays pretty good. And then I sort of drew so that happened in 63. And I kind of wrote about later on in the year, like Rose, goes on to have this great year. But then later on in that year, John F. Kennedy comes to Al Lopez Field to speak. And obviously this was 4 days before he was assassinated. There was a huge crowd of people. It was the biggest crowd at Al Lopez Field. It was in November, it was just before he was killed, and how they had to move the games. They had the instructional league games going on at that time. They had to move the game because all of a sudden, no, the president's coming to Al Lopez Field, Reds, you have to go play somewhere else. So they ended up moving the game to Clearwater. But, he comes and then he speaks and he gets assassinated. And there was a lot written about how Tampa took it very hard because even though they didn't know him that well, they had just met him and they really felt like, he had spoken to them. And then, here at the following January, they named the highway, after Kennedy, Kennedy Boulevard. And then a month later, Pete Rose gets his Rookie of the Year award, So I tried to kind of write about all that happening in 1 year, and how it was, they were pretty, those were things that were pretty huge in our life. I mean, Pete Rose and John F. Kennedy, no, I get it. You can't compare them. But if you're a baseball fan, you kind of see that, who had a bigger impact on the game than Rose for a long time, So and it all happened right on the same field, so that's kind of, I enjoyed trying to find a little bit of a way to put that into one chapter. I'm not exactly sure it worked, but I really enjoyed. And then, when Kennedy was assassinated, how the baseball world responded. The instructional league games, like I said, I think the Bay Area, we took it hard. Because he had just been here. And so they postponed a number of days of games because of what happened. And I never even knew anything about that. I didn't know any of that was going on. We all, we knew the NFL was playing at that time and they didn't play their games, I think, one Sunday, but I didn't know anything about even the instructional league stopped playing their games for a while. So I really enjoyed, researching that and reading about that, and then trying to make some sense out of it.
Well, again, I appreciate all your hard work and how you're able to tell the story in a way that, sometimes I'm reading, it's like, when I read, I hate to say it, but sometimes when I'm reading, it can be a burdensome process. That's not the case with your book. I know even when I'm writing, I say, good Lord, Mark, just stop. You know how to write run-on sentences, don't you? I mean, come on. But Rick, with you're able to put a lot of color and a lot of story in a sharp piece here and there. And for people like me who've had a hard time with attention, the chapters are short enough that I can continue to read it. It's engaging. It's, I hate to say, sometimes reading's burdensome, but not with your book, man. So thank you for that. It's a great book.
I wanted to keep it simple. I didn't want this to be a burden thing to read. I wanted it to be fun. I wanted you just to learn stuff that you didn't know.
Yeah.
But I didn't want it to be like a history lesson either. I just wanted it. One of the reviews I got on the book, the first book, was like, it was a breezy look. And I like that because that's kind of what I was going for. A lot of information, but not overwhelming, and written kind of in a pretty simple style, because that's me. Keep it simple. That's me, keeping things simple.
Well, I can tell you, as a baseball fan and somebody who loves this stuff, you achieved it. Man, we appreciate it.
Well, it's been therapy for me too, Mark. I've been out of baseball now for 8 years, and it's hard, it's your life, and I'm fortunate, married to the same woman for 45 years who was very independent when she had to be when I was on the road a lot, but it's hard to get it out of your blood. And so this is a way that keeps me connected to the game. I'm happy people like yourself enjoy reading the book. For me, I just enjoyed writing it.
Well, you've been doing a lot for this community. Is there a specific charity you've been working with?
Well, I've been volunteering since I left the Rays, primarily with Metropolitan Ministries and the Homeless Empowerment Program, and I'm on the board for Clearwater for Youth. Those are my three primary ones as a volunteer. And then about 3 or 4 months ago, the Homeless Empowerment Program, HEP, who I've been volunteering there for 8 years in the kitchen. They brought me on board to help with some PR stuff. So I've been I enjoy it. Really love working with their staff over there, and we have a great relationship because they know me well because I've been volunteering there for so long. And back when I was with the Rays, I was on their board, so it's very comfortable for me. And they pretty much leave it up to me. They're like, "Look, you know what we're trying to do here. Just do your thing." So I'm really enjoying that too. So pretty much volunteering still, and then getting paid to do some PR for the Homeless Empowerment Program. They're over in Clearwater. They do unbelievably great work getting people out of homelessness and back on their feet. They have a success rate we have primarily families and veterans there. Their success rate with families, getting them back and not returning to homelessness, of 87%. And with veterans, it's 83%. So that what they, and they provide tremendous support, not just beds and food, but, health stuff, job placement, everything you can think of. So I'm so proud to be a part of it. And now I'm kind of an employee there. So that's pretty cool. So that's what I spend most of my time doing. You'll get a kick out of this. A couple times a week, I score the official score for these complex league games, which used to be the old Gulf Coast League, and it's the lowest minor league. It's the kids they just come over here. They're all 18 years old. So I score a couple of those games a week. It's like 98 degrees out, and you're sitting out watching baseball being played. It's not exactly major league quality, but I have a blast doing it. I love doing it, and you get to see some really good prospects too. So that keeps me pretty busy. Yeah, I'm pretty busy these days, and I'm real happy about that.
Well, I'm going to draw attention to it with the organization you're working with, who's helping the homeless, and I know that's a big issue here in Florida, probably elsewhere too. So thank you for that, Rick.
Thank you very much, Mark.
You have been listening to Baseball Biz on Deck with Mark's special guest, Rick Vaughn, baseball executive and author of Tampa Spring Training Tales. Just a reminder, you can find Mark on Blue Sky at baseballbizondeck.bsky.social. You may also find Baseball Biz on Deck on iHeart, Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, and at www.baseballbizondeck.com. Special thanks to XTakeRUX for the music, Rocking Forward.